Washington, D.C. The time is exactly 6 p.m. In Tel Aviv, it is midnight. This is the precise moment the British mandate for Palestine expires. For 30 years, the British Empire has ruled this strip of land, but now the Union Jack is coming down. And as it lowers, the entire Middle East is poised to explode. In the Oval Office, President Harry S. Truman sits at his mahogany desk, staring at a short, typewritten statement. His heart is racing. He knows that in exactly 11 minutes, the news tickers will scream a headline that will change history forever. But right now, he is arguably the loneliest man in the world. The entire U.S. State Department, the most powerful diplomatic machine on earth, is essentially in open revolt against him. His own ambassadors at the United Nations have no idea what he is about to do. They are currently giving speeches promising that the U.S. will not support a Jewish state. Truman is about to make liars out of them all. Why the secrecy? Because this isn't just a political decision, it's a coup. Truman isn't just fighting the Arabs or the British, he is fighting his own government. General George Marshall, the hero of World War II, the man Truman reveres above all others, has told him that signing this document is a catastrophic mistake. The CIA has warned that Jewish independence will lead to a massacre. The oil companies are threatening an energy crisis. Yet Truman picks up his pen. He glances at the clock, 6:10 p.m. The new state of Israel has existed for 10 minutes in a legal vacuum. If he waits any longer, the moment might pass. If he signs, he might lose the upcoming election, alienate his allies, and start a world war. But Truman remembers a verse from the Bible, and he remembers the faces of the refugees he saw in newsreels. At 6:11 p.m., just 11 minutes after the British mandate ends, he signs the order. The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority of the new state of Israel. With that single stroke of a pen, he didn't just recognize a country, he defied the world order. And the story of how a farm boy from Missouri came to defy the entire global establishment is the most unbelievable political thriller of the 20th century. To understand why Truman risked everything for those 11 minutes, we have to travel back 3 years to the smoking ruins of 1945. The Nazis have been defeated, but for the Jews of Europe, the nightmare hasn't ended. It has just changed shape. Over 250,000 Jewish survivors constitute what is known as the Shiret HaPletah, the surviving remnant. They are living in displaced persons camps, often just a few miles from the concentration camps where their families were murdered. They are starving, sick, and surrounded by the ghosts of the past. They cannot return to their homes in Poland or Germany. Their neighbors have stolen their property, and pogroms are still breaking out even after the war. They have only one dream: Palestine. But the doors are locked. Enter Harry Truman. He is an accidental president, thrust into power after FDR's death only months earlier. He is a man of simple, rigid morality. When he sees the reports from the camps, he is physically ill. He commissions a man named Earl Harrison to inspect these camps, and the resulting Earl Harrison report lands on his desk like a grenade. It details how Jews are still living under armed guard, wearing striped uniforms, with no hope. Harrison writes a sentence that burns into Truman's soul. We appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except that we do not exterminate them. Truman is horrified. He immediately writes to British Prime Minister Clement Attlee, demanding that 100,000 Jewish refugees be allowed into Palestine immediately. It seems like a simple humanitarian request, but the British response is cold, cynical, and brutal. Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin mocks the survivors, publicly stating that the Jews just want to push to the front of the queue. Bevin's cruelty enrages Truman. The president realizes that the refined diplomats of London and Washington don't see human beings, they see a demographic problem. This is the moment the seed was planted. Truman decides that if the world won't give these people a home, he will help them build one. But he has no idea that this moral crusade is about to pit him against the most respected man in America. By the freezing dawn of early 1948, the situation in Palestine had descended into absolute, uncontrollable chaos. The United Nations had voted in November 1947 to partition the land into 2 states, one Arab, one Jewish, a decision that was supposed to bring peace. Instead, it brought fire. On the ground, a brutal civil war was already raging. Jewish convoys were being ambushed in the hills of Jerusalem. Arab villages were being raided.
The British, who were supposed to be keeping order, were simply packing their bags. They were withdrawing, but not in an orderly handover. They were leaving a dangerous power vacuum, deliberately letting the clock run out while violence sucked in the entire region. In Washington, a different kind of war was being fought, a silent, bureaucratic coup within the walls of the State Department. A powerful clique of career diplomats known as the Arabists, led by the fiercely anti-Zionist Loy Henderson, made their move. These men believed that American interests lay entirely with the oil-rich Arab nations, and that supporting a Jewish state was geopolitical suicide. They whispered constantly in Truman's ear, terrifying him with Cold War nightmares. They warned that a Jewish state would be nothing more than a Soviet satellite in the Middle East, a communist beachhead that would allow Stalin to cut off the West's oil supply. Under this immense, relentless pressure, Truman began to waver. He was a man besieged, receiving thousands of letters a day, pulled between his moral conscience and the terrifying warnings of World War III. Then came the moment of ultimate humiliation. Black Friday, March 19, 1948. Without consulting the president, and perhaps counting on his ignorance, the State Department authorized the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Warren Austin, to drop a diplomatic bomb. Standing before the Security Council, Austin shocked the world by announcing that the United States was abandoning the partition plan. He proposed instead a UN trusteeship, essentially declaring that the Jews were not ready for a state and that the promise of independence was revoked. The reaction was instant and catastrophic. The Jews were devastated, feeling the world had turned their back on them again. The Arab leaders were triumphant, sensing American weakness. Truman was literally asleep when it happened. When he woke up the next morning and read the headlines, he didn't just get angry, he went apoplectic. He wrote in his diary, his pen nearly tearing the paper. "The State Department pulled the rug right out from under me today. The first I know about it is what I see in the papers. I am now in the position of a liar and a double-crosser." The betrayal cut deep. Just the day before, he had secretly met with Chaim Weizmann and given his solemn word, "You can bank on me." Now, thanks to his own diplomats, He looked like a fool and a hypocrite on the world stage. But this humiliation didn't break him. It hardened him like steel. It was the precise moment Harry Truman decided to stop listening to the experts who viewed the world through maps and oil pipelines and start listening to his own gut. The damage was done. The Jews no longer trusted him, and the clock was still ticking toward war. But the sleeping giant in the Oval Office had finally woken up. By March 1948, the White House had become a fortress. Truman, furious and humiliated after the Black Friday reversal on partition, had ordered a total communication blackout on the subject of Palestine. He instructed his staff to throw Zionist letters into the trash and to block all calls from Jewish leaders. He felt personally insulted by the aggressive tactics of American Zionist lobbyists, particularly Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver, who had famously pounded his fist on the president's desk and shouted at him. Truman, a man who valued courtesy above all else, had snapped. Jesus Christ couldn't please them when he was on earth, so how could anyone expect that I would have any luck? He fumed to his cabinet. The dream of Israel was dying not on the battlefield, but in the silence of the Oval Office. Even Chaim Weizmann, the legendary ailing statesman of the Zionist movement, had traveled all the way from London to New York, only to be left sitting in his hotel room like a beggar, refused an audience. Desperate and running out of time, Jewish leaders realized they needed a miracle. They didn't need a diplomat, they needed a friend. They found him in Kansas City, a balding, unassuming haberdasher named Eddie Jacobson. Eddie was Truman's old army buddy from World War I and his partner in a failed clothing store they ran together in the 1920s. He had never asked Truman for a political favor in his life. When he arrived at the White House on March 13, he didn't even have an appointment. He simply walked up to the appointment secretary, Matt Connolly, and said, "I need to see the boss." Because he was Eddie, he was waved through. But when he walked into the Oval Office, the warmth vanished. Truman knew why he was there. He stiffened, his eyes cold. Before Eddie could even sit down, Truman barked, "I won't see them, Eddie. I'm fed up with these people. Disrespectful, mean." He launched into a tirade about how he had been harassed and harangued. Eddie sat quietly, letting the president vent his spleen. It looked hopeless.
Then Eddie did something brilliant. He saw a small bust of Andrew Jackson, Truman's personal hero, on the desk. He stood up, walked over to the president, and played the only card he had, pure emotion. "Harry," he said, his voice trembling, "you have a hero in that statue. You worship Andrew Jackson. I have a hero too. His name is Chaim Weizmann. He is a very sick man, the greatest Jew alive, and he's sitting in New York, broken-hearted because you won't see him." He paused, looking deep into his friend's eyes. "I never thought the day would come when you would lock your doors against a man like that." The room went deadly silent. Truman turned his swivel chair around and stared out the window at the rose garden. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. 1 minute, 2 minutes. Eddie held his breath, thinking he had ruined their friendship forever. Finally, Truman spun his chair back around. The anger was gone, replaced by a twinkle in his eye. He looked at his old partner and grinned. "You bald-headed son of a bitch," he said softly. "You got me." He picked up his calendar and whispered, "Tell Matt to sneak Weizmann in the East Gate. No press."
That single moment of vulnerability between two old friends broke the diplomatic logjam and changed the course of the Middle East forever. We are now 48 hours away from the deadline. It is May 12, 1948. The most important meeting of Harry Truman's presidency is taking place in the Oval Office. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Truman has gathered his top advisors to make the final decision. On one side is Clark Clifford, Truman's young, ambitious political advisor. On the other is the formidable General George Marshall. Truman asks Clifford to present the case for recognizing the Jewish state. Clifford delivers a brilliant, passionate argument evoking international law, humanitarian duty, and the strategic value of a democratic ally in the Middle East. He speaks for 20 minutes, dismantling the State Department's fears. When Clifford finishes, he looks at Marshall. The old general's face is red with suppressed rage. He ignores Clifford completely and turns to Truman. "Mr. President," Marshall says, his voice trembling with anger, "I don't know what's going on here. I thought this was a meeting on policy, not a political rally." He then drops the bombshell. He tells Truman that Clifford's advice is based on domestic politics, trying to win the Jewish vote in New York and not on national security. Marshall then delivers the most devastating line ever spoken by a Secretary of State to a president. "If you follow Clifford's advice, and if I were to vote in the election, I would vote against you." The room freezes. It is a direct challenge to Truman's authority. Everyone expects Truman to back down. Marshall is a national icon. Truman is a struggling politician with a 36% approval rating. If Marshall resigns in protest, Truman's presidency is over. Truman, pale and shaken, simply says, "I think we must sleep on this." The meeting ends in terrifying silence. The next 24 hours are a blur of secret negotiations. Truman knows he cannot afford to lose Marshall, but he also cannot abandon the Jews. He needs a way to recognize Israel without humiliating his Secretary of State. He sends Under-Secretary of State Robert Lovett to calm Marshall down. Lovett argues that while the general's concerns are valid, the president has the ultimate constitutional authority to recognize foreign governments. Marshall, a man of strict military discipline, finally relents. He agrees not to resign, but he refuses to support the decision publicly. "I will not vote against the president," he grumbles, "but I cannot tell him he is right." It is a fragile truce, but it is enough. Meanwhile, chaos reigns at the United Nations. The U.S. delegation is still pushing for trusteeship, unaware that the policy has changed. In Tel Aviv, Ben-Gurion is preparing to declare independence, but he doesn't know if anyone will recognize them. He is taking a massive gamble. Without U.S. recognition, the new state might be strangled at birth by international sanctions. As the clock ticked toward the 6 p.m. deadline in Washington, the drama shifted from high strategy to a comedy of errors. In a small office at the Jewish Agency in Washington, Representative Eliyahu Epstein was frantically typing the formal request that the White House had demanded. But there was a massive problem. He didn't know the name of the new country. The leaders in Tel Aviv had been debating it for days. Would it be Zion, Judah, Ever? Communications were spotty, and no telegram had arrived. Epstein couldn't wait. He took a gamble and typed "the Jewish state" into the official letter, sending it by messenger to the White House. He literally had to guess the name of the nation he was asking the president to recognize.
Meanwhile, inside the Oval Office, the scene was equally chaotic. Truman's legal counsel, Clark Clifford, was preparing the president's response. In the mad rush to beat the deadline, there was no time to find fancy diplomatic parchment. The most significant foreign policy document of the 20th century was typed on a plain, ordinary sheet of white paper. And because they were working off Epstein's vague letter, the draft originally read, "The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority of the new Jewish state." Then, at the last possible second, a news flash came over the wire from Tel Aviv. Ben-Gurion had announced the name, Israel. When the typed document landed on Truman's desk, he didn't send it back for a retype. There was no time. He took his fountain pen and, with a bold, decisive hand, he scratched out the words, "New Jewish State." Above them, in his own handwriting, he scrolled, "State of Israel." That simple correction, looking like a school teacher grading a paper, became the birth certificate of a nation. At exactly 6:11 p.m., 11 minutes after the British mandate expired, Truman's press secretary, Charlie Ross, gathered the reporters in his office. He had actually locked the doors to prevent anyone from leaving early. "The President has issued a statement," he announced casually. He handed out the mimeographed copies. The reporters glanced at the paper, and then the room exploded. They gasped, dropped their notebooks, and raced for the telephones, fighting to be the first to scream, "Get me the desk! He did it! Truman recognized them!" But the most dramatic scene was happening 200 miles away at the United Nations in New York. The U.S. Ambassador, Warren Austin, was in the middle of a speech, unaware that his boss had just pulled the rug out from under him again. A rumor swept through the General Assembly Hall. Delegates started whispering. A ticker-tape machine in the hallway chattered out the news. When an aide whispered it to the U.S. delegation, they thought it was a sick joke. "The President would never do that without telling us," one diplomat said. But he had. When Austin realized it was true, he was so humiliated that he simply stood up, packed his briefcase, and walked out of the hall in a daze, leaving his empty chair to face the shouting delegates. The entire assembly erupted into chaos. The Soviet diplomats were stunned. They had planned to be the first to recognize Israel, to embarrass the U.S., but Truman had beaten them by hours. The British were apoplectic, but the deed was done. In 11 frantic minutes, Harry Truman had cut the Gordian knot of Middle East politics. He had defied his advisors, his allies, and logic itself. And in doing so, he had secured his place in history and, potentially, his own re-election. While Washington was paralyzed by indecision, another player was making a move on the chessboard: Joseph Stalin. This is the hidden layer of the story that most people forget. The Soviet Union was actually supporting the creation of Israel. Why? Not because Stalin loved Jews. He was actively persecuting them at home. But because he wanted to kick the British Empire out of the Middle East. He saw the Jewish state as a wedge to break British colonial power. Truman knew this. His intelligence reports screamed that if America didn't recognize Israel, the Soviets would be the first to do it, posing as the saviors of the Jewish people. Imagine the geopolitical nightmare. A Soviet-aligned Israel, armed by the Eastern Bloc, providing the Red Army a warm water port in the Mediterranean. This fear was the final push Truman needed to silence the doubters in his own cabinet. He realized that recognizing Israel wasn't just a moral act, it was a Cold War necessity. The 11-minute decision was partly a race against Moscow. And indeed, just days after Truman's de facto recognition, the Soviet Union became the first country to recognize Israel de jure, legally and fully. The arms that saved Israel in the coming war didn't come from America, which had an arms embargo. They came from Czechoslovakia, with Stalin's blessing. Truman's 11-minute head start prevented the Soviets from claiming the moral victory, keeping Israel in the orbit of Western democracy. It was a masterstroke of intuition that outplayed the master strategist in the Kremlin. By late May 1948, the dust had begun to settle in Washington, even as the war for survival raged in the hills of Galilee. The political battle was won, but the personal toll on Truman had been immense. He had alienated his most trusted advisors and risked his political future. But vindication came swiftly. On May 25, 1948, just 11 days after the Declaration of Independence, Chaim Weizmann returned to the White House. The contrast with his previous visit could not have been starker.
2 months earlier, he had been a desperate petitioner, sneaking in through the East Gate to avoid the press. Now he arrived as the first president of the sovereign state of Israel. He was received with full honors, staying at Blair House, the president's guest house, with the flags of both nations flying side by side, a sight that would have been unimaginable just weeks before. In the Rose Garden, under the glare of newsreel cameras, Weizmann presented Truman with a gift that symbolized thousands of years of Jewish history, a small Torah scroll. It was wrapped in blue velvet and adorned with silver ornaments. As Weizmann handed it to him, he said, "I wanted to give you this as a token of our gratitude. Thanks to you, the Jewish people have been given a new life." Truman, the tough-talking politician who had dropped the atomic bomb and stared down the Soviet Union, was visibly moved. He held the sacred scroll awkwardly but reverently. "I always wanted one of these," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. He turned to his old friend Eddie Jacobson, who was standing there, beaming with pride, and said, "I always told you, Eddie, I wanted to do the right thing." This moment reveals the true core of Harry Truman. He wasn't a polished intellectual or a geopolitical theorist like the men in the State Department who despised him. He was a man of simple faith and gut instinct, a student of the Bible who believed in right and wrong. The depth of his conviction became clear years later, after he had left office. In 1953, Israel's chief rabbi, Isaac Herzog, visited Truman in New York. The rabbi looked at the former president and said, "God put you in your mother's womb so that you could be the instrument to bring about the rebirth of Israel after 2,000 years. Tears streamed down Truman's face. He didn't deny it. Instead, he turned to his guests and declared with absolute certainty, "I didn't help create it. I am Cyrus. I am Cyrus." He saw himself not as a politician making a calculation, but as the modern reincarnation of Cyrus the Great, the Persian king who freed the Jews from Babylonian captivity. Those 11 minutes weren't a strategy. In his mind, they were a divine appointment. So why does a dusty decision from 1948 matter to you today? Why should we care about 11 minutes that ticked by over 75 years ago? Because those 11 minutes didn't just change a map,
they created the bedrock of the modern world. Think about it. The relationship between the United States and Israel, often called the unbreakable bond, wasn't inevitable. It wasn't built on signed treaties, military alliances, or shared economic interests. In 1948, the U.S. had an arms embargo on Israel. The Pentagon wanted nothing to do with the Jewish state. This alliance was built entirely on a moral choice made by one lonely man against the screaming advice of his entire government. Imagine if Truman had blinked. Imagine if he had listened to the experts like General Marshall. Without that immediate U.S. recognition, Israel would have been born as an international pariah. The United Nations would have likely imposed a trusteeship, turning the country into a permanent ward of the international community, strangled by bureaucracy while Arab armies advanced. Or worse, the Soviet Union would have stepped into the vacuum, becoming Israel's patron and turning the Holy Land into a Soviet outpost. The entire history of the Cold War, the Middle East, and global democracy would look radically different. Truman's decision didn't just save a country, it saved the West from a catastrophic geopolitical failure. But the real lesson here isn't about geopolitics, it's about leadership. We live in an age where leaders are obsessed with polls, focus groups, and data-driven decisions. Harry Truman reminds us that true leadership is often lonely, unpopular, and defies the data. He was a failed businessman, a man with no college degree. Mockingbirds called him an accidental president. Yet, when the smartest men in the room, the Ivy League diplomats and the five-star generals told him he was wrong, he had the courage to trust his conscience. He understood something they didn't, that history isn't moved by oil pipelines or strategic calculations, but by right and wrong. As we look at the conflicts of today, at a world that feels increasingly unstable, the story of those 11 minutes offers a piercing truth. One person can stop the clock. One person, armed with nothing but a pen and a moral compass, can stand against the tide. It took 2,000 years of exile, prayers, and suffering to bring the Jewish people to the brink of home, but it took just 11 minutes of courage to open the door. Harry Truman proved that destiny doesn't just happen, it is chosen. And sometimes the fate of nations rests on a single word: yes.